Bowel polyps are essentially tiny growths in the lining of the bowel. So normally the bowel wall contains a lot of cells and they constantly sort of refresh each other. And most of the cells die out and then they reform again. Sometimes the cells sort of grow slightly more in number compared to other cells, and therefore, when it keeps happening, you get these outgrowths. Those are called polyps. The majority of polyps do not cause any symptoms because they are very tiny. Majority of them are, and they just are present in the lining. So they're all found out when they have a procedure like a camera exam, a colonoscopy, or a sigmoidoscopy. These tests are endoscopy tests, which are used to assess the bowel. So that's the main modality when these polyps are found out incidentally. Sometimes, very, very rarely, when polyps keep growing and become very huge, they can cause some blockage type symptoms where the bowel sort of lining gets narrowed, or sometimes they can cause bleeding. So those are the two occurrences where they can cause symptoms, but majority of polyps do not produce any symptoms. Bowel polyps are caused by mechanisms which take a long period of time. So normally the cells in the lining of the bowel keep renewing themselves over time. So old cells die out and then new cells form. Sometimes the code in these cells gets a little bit changed so that more cells are formed. And when they are not switched off, they keep sort of producing more and more cells actually. So that's how these polyps form. And these pathways have been studied by research scientists for decades. So we know how these polyps form. And they take many, many years, sometimes decades to form as well. Not all bowel polyps are cancerous because majority of them are what we call as benign, meaning that they do not progress to cancer. However, a small percentage of polyps can develop into cancer. So, the only way of knowing it is when the polyps are removed, they get sent off to a lab to be examined under the microscope. So that's the main sort of modality which tells us whether there are cancer cells in the polyp. But, the majority of the polyps are all non-cancerous. There's been international consensus among doctors and specialists in bowel doctors that polyps can eventually grow into cancer over a long period of time. Again, which polyp can turn into cancer is a bit of a difficult thing to know. So whenever we find polyps during the camera tests, if they are amenable to be removed, then we usually recommend removing them. And we remove them by means of different types of techniques. And the commonest one is called a wire loop or a snare. It's basically like a lasso which sits over the polyp, and then we can sort of snare it off the lining of the bowel so it comes away. And it doesn't cause any pain when we do this particular type of snare removal.